got the drone link! It's inside our synchronization grid!
You never scanned our people!
They scanned Earth for 11 seconds. 11 seconds to decide that 7 billion lives weren't worth a second look. No planetary shields, no orbital defense grid, no warning beacons. To the Vantiri Dominion, humanity looked like a species that had simply forgotten to grow up. "Primitive," said Fleet Commander Ozrel Kade, watching the readout scroll across his bridge. "No energy signatures above industrial grade. No weapons in orbit. This will not even qualify as a conquest. It's a formality." 2,000 kilometers below him, in a converted grain silo outside Lubbock, Texas, Myra Voss was elbow-deep in 40-year-old wiring, trying to keep the last regional power relay alive before winter hit. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a scientist with a secret weapon in her basement. She was 46 years old, she smelled like solder flux, and she kept a photograph of her son Danny taped inside her toolbox. A boy who died at 19 because a hospital 3 counties over lost power during a blackout, and the backup generator failed 9 minutes too late. Mara had spent the 7 years since then doing one thing: making sure the grid never failed anyone else the way it failed her son. She knew every relay, every dead frequency, every ghost circuit humanity had built and abandoned across a century of electrification. Nobody else alive understood this particular tangle of old iron and forgotten code the way she did. The Vantiri didn't know that. They didn't care. Why would they? Their sensors had told them everything they needed. A species with no shields couldn't possibly have anything worth fearing. Above the atmosphere, the flagship Ozrel's will began its descent vector, engines humming with the lazy confidence of a predator that has never once been wrong. Myra looked up from her work at the sound, a distant thunder that didn't belong to any storm. The sky over Lubbock had turned the color of a bruise, and something enormous was pushing through the clouds. She set down her tools very slowly. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to end quietly. The ship broke atmosphere over the Texas panhandle like a falling cathedral, 3 kilometers of black hull blotting out the sun. Commander Kade watched the terrified crowd scatter on his view screen and allowed himself something close to boredom. "Broadcast the surrender terms," he ordered. "Standard Tier 9 format. They likely won't understand half the words, but formality must be observed." His communications officer complied. A voice like grinding stone rolled out of every phone, television, and radio speaker across 3 states. "Your species is now property of the Vantiri Dominion. Resistance will not be acknowledged, as resistance is not possible." That was Stage 1, contempt dressed as courtesy. Stage 2 came an hour later, when a handful of National Guard units, acting on pure instinct and no orders, fired everything they had at the ship's underside. Kade didn't even reroute power. He simply let the return fire, a single lazy pulse from a secondary turret, vaporize 4 vehicles and a quarter-mile of highway. The message was clear: "You cannot hurt us, and we will not pretend otherwise." Mara watched the footage on a dying battery radio, jaw tight, hands steady. Stage 3 was worse. The Vantiri began landing harvesting drones, squat, insectal machines built to strip cities of metal and minerals with mechanical patience. One touched down 2 miles from Myra's silo, in the middle of the regional substation that fed power to 11 small hospitals. For one heartbeat, Myra believed there might be help coming. Some part of her still expected a fighter jet, a secret government installation, someone with more authority and better tools than a woman with a wrench. No one came. The drone's claws closed around the substation's main transformer, and the lights across 3 counties began to die, 1 town at a time, like a heart running out of beats. She thought of Danny. 9 minutes. That's all it had taken. The drone paused, sensors sweeping the silo where she stood, an unshielded human structure, unarmed, insignificant. It didn't even bother powering a weapon. Why would it? The scan said there was nothing here worth destroying. It turned away to continue its harvest. Mara was already moving toward the relay panel she'd rebuilt with her own hands, the one piece of infrastructure on this entire continent that only she understood well enough to break on purpose. Above her in orbit, Commander Kade received a routine status update and didn't even glance at it. He had no idea he was about to lose everything to a woman his sensors said didn't exist. The first sign something was wrong reached the Ozrel's will as a flicker, nothing more. A single power spike from the surface, gone almost before it registered, the kind of anomaly a Vantiri technician would normally dismiss without a second thought. Minor fluctuation in the primitive grid, the technician reported. Irrelevant. It was not irrelevant. Mara had spent 7 years mapping every dead frequency the old American grid had ever used, military test bands, decommissioned radar loops, forgotten resonance channels nobody alive except her still remembered how to reach. She wasn't fighting the Vantiri's shields, their weapons, or their armor. She was reaching past all of it, into the one thing their scanners had judged too primitive to matter. Humanity's ancient, tangled, half-forgotten infrastructure, and she was about to make it scream. She slammed the relay breaker home and rerouted 11 substations worth of stored charge through a single dead military frequency. One the Vantiri's own harvesting drones used to synchronize with the mothership's landing systems. It wasn't a weapon. It was a lie spoken in a language their machines were built to trust completely. The drone outside the silo seized mid-motion, its claws locking around the transformer it had just begun to crush. Then, following the false synchronization signal Mara had just fed it, it did exactly what it was built to do. It broadcast a full system handshake back to the mothership, carrying, buried inside it, every ounce of the overloaded charge Mara had just poured into the line. Aboard the Ozrel's will, the flicker became a spike. The spike became an alarm. The alarm became 11 alarms, screaming across a bridge that had never once needed to sound them. "Power surge in the landing bay relay?" the technician shouted, his composure finally cracking. Source is the drone network, Commander. It's inside our synchronization grid." Kade turned just in time to see the first drone feed conduit rupture in a shower of white sparks. "Cut the link," he roared, too late. Mara's overload didn't need to breach their shields. It walked in through the front door those shields were never built to guard. The trusted, unshielded handshake between a Vantiri drone and its own mothership. Conduit after conduit failed in a chain reaction, breakers popping like gunfire down 3 decks, the ship's own landing bay systems tearing themselves apart from the inside. Kade felt the deck shudder beneath his boots for the first time in his career. "Impossible," he whispered. "Their planet has no shields." He finally understood in the half-second before the lights failed across half his ship exactly what his sensors had missed. Vantiri scans measured armor, weapons, and shields. They had never once measured a single human being who refused to let anyone else's child die the way hers had, and had spent 7 years turning that grief into precision. The Ozrel's will didn't fall from the sky. It limped, scorched, half-blind, its landing bay gutted, back up through the clouds it had descended through so confidently hours before, leaving its harvesting drones dead in the dirt across the Texas Panhandle. Commander Kade stood in the wreckage of his own bridge, surrounded by sparking consoles and the smell of burnt circuitry, and gave the only order left to him. "Withdraw the fleet. Flag this system. Do not engage." Within 6 hours, word reached 3 neighboring systems in the Dominion sphere. Within 6 days, it reached the Dominion's High Council itself, not as a victory report, but as a warning stamped in red across 100 command decks. An unshielded, unweaponized planet had turned a first-contact invasion into a retreat, using nothing but its own infrastructure and a single operator no scan had flagged as a threat. Earth was quietly reclassified, not primitive, not conquered. A new designation, one the Dominion had never needed before: unknown risk, do not assume weakness. Back in Lubbock, the lights came on again 3 days later, county by county, as Cruz Myra had trained herself rebuilt what the drone had torn apart. She didn't stand on a stage. Nobody called her a hero on television. She simply walked back into the same silo, opened the same toolbox, and looked at the photograph taped inside the lid. "Nobody else is losing 9 minutes, she said quietly, to no one but Danny. "Not on my watch." She closed the toolbox, picked up her wrench, and went back to work, because somewhere out there, another grid was waiting to be rebuilt, and she intended to make sure it never failed anyone again. Humanity hadn't won because it was strongest. It hadn't won because it was armed, or shielded, or ready. It won because somewhere in Texas, one woman's grief had quietly rewritten the rules of a war the galaxy didn't know it was fighting. They came looking for a species with no shields. They left knowing some things don't need one.